Sabine Kroll smoothed her silk gloves, smiled at the crowd gathered inside the grand hall, and said it loudly enough for everyone to hear. Someone should remind the kitchen girl that charity and cooking are the only things a beggar widow is fit for. The room went quiet. 40 pairs of eyes turned toward Lenora Vance, 19 years old, still wearing a dress that had survived 3 river crossings and a blizzard, standing near the doorway with flour on her hands and nowhere to hide. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She walked straight into that woman's kitchen and started baking. And before the night was over, every single person in that hall would choose her pie over Sabine Kroll's imported feast, while Rourke Calder stood before the entire valley and said the words that changed everything. But none of that could have happened without the 40 people who almost starved first. This is their story, and hers. If this kind of story about ordinary people surviving impossible things with nothing but grit and quiet dignity speaks to something in you, please subscribe to this channel and follow along to the very end. Every week we bring you stories that remind you what human beings are truly made of. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The ground was still frozen when Lenora buried her husband. She didn't have a proper shovel. One of the men from the wagon train had lent her a pickaxe and a flat-edged spade that had already broken once and been repaired with a strip of leather. The earth resisted every blow. Her arms gave out twice. She kept going. Thomas Vance had been 22 years old. He had laughed easily, argued about nothing important, and believed with his whole chest that Oregon would fix everything wrong with their lives. He was wrong about Oregon. He was wrong about a lot of things. But he had been hers, and now he was 4 feet under frozen Kansas dirt, and Lenora had 41 miles of nothing ahead of her and $14 to her name. She stood at the grave until her feet went numb. Then she walked back to the wagon. There were things to do. That was the truth nobody told you about grief when you were 19. It didn't stop the world. The oxen still needed water. The harness on the Detweiler wagon had cracked and needed to be threaded through a different buckle before they could move. Old Mrs. Garrett had been coughing since before dawn, and someone had to find a way to keep her warm enough to survive another night on the open trail without wasting wood they couldn't spare. Grief was real. Grief was enormous, but it waited in line like everything else. Lenora had discovered, somewhere between Missouri and the place where Thomas stopped breathing, that she had a particular kind of mind. She could look at what was in front of her: 3 cups of flour, half a side of salted pork going gray at the edges, a handful of dried beans that had been in someone's sack since before anyone could remember, and see not what was missing, but what was possible. It wasn't a skill she'd been taught. It was more like a reflex, a survival instinct wearing an apron. The wagon train had 42 people when it left Independence. It had 40 when Lenora buried Thomas, the fever having taken one other man 3 weeks before. They were led by a wagon master named Heck Dodson, who was competent and tired and had been doing this route for 11 years and had never once arrived at any destination with the same number of people he'd started with. He accepted this as a condition of the work, the way a carpenter accepts sawdust. Heck liked Lenora because she never complained to him directly. She complained plenty she was not a saint, but she did it to herself quietly while she worked. He had known women who folded after losing less than she had. He watched her closely those first days after Thomas died, waiting for the collapse. It didn't come. What came instead was supper. She had started cooking for other people almost immediately, partly because it gave her hands something to do, partly because the alternative was sitting alone in a wagon that still smelled like her husband's coat. The food she produced was never fancy. There were no recipes. She worked with what existed: the aging pork, the beans, the flour, whatever wild roots she could identify along the creek banks, whatever the men brought back from hunting. She boiled things down until they became something worth eating. She stretched portions the way you stretch a wool blanket in winter, carefully, firmly, making sure every edge covered something. People noticed. They didn't say much at first. Men on wagon trains rarely said much about anything that didn't involve axles or river crossings. But they came to eat, and they came back for more. And the portions were never quite as small as the supplies should have made them. That was the first miracle, though nobody called it that. The second miracle was harder to see coming. 3 weeks out from the burial ground, the sky changed. Lenora had been awake since before the sky lightened. Sitting at the back of the wagon, she now shared with the Reed family, out of pure practicality, a 15-year-old orphan named Tamsin and her widowed aunt, who had herself died of a lung infection 10 days earlier, leaving Tamsin entirely alone. Lenora had simply moved her 2 bags into their wagon without asking anyone's permission because the alternative was a 15-year-old girl sleeping by herself with no family and no anchor. And that was not something Lenora was capable of allowing. Tamsin was quiet in the way children were quiet when they had learned that asking for things rarely produced results. She had dark eyes that watched everything and said very little, and she had been raised, it seemed, by the particular American philosophy that suffering was something you endured privately and without burdening others. Lenora found this both understandable and infuriating. "You're allowed to be angry," Lenora told her one morning, handing her the first cup of coffee, more hot water than coffee, but the ritual mattered. Tamsin looked at her over the rim. "What good does angry do?" "Nothing. But it's honest." Tamsin was quiet for a moment. "My aunt used to say the same thing. Smart woman. She died anyway." There was nothing good to say to that, so Lenora didn't try. She handed her a piece of cornbread instead, and they sat together in the gray morning light, watching the oxen breathe steam into the cold air. It was that morning that Heck Dodson came to find her with his hat in his hands, which was never a good sign. "I need you to come look at the provisions wagon," he said. She followed him without asking questions. What she saw in that wagon made her stomach drop. The flour barrel had been compromised, moisture had gotten in, probably at the last river crossing, and a significant portion of what they had was clumped and gray and starting to smell. The dried meat supply was lower than Heck had believed, because someone with a particular flatness. That meant he knew exactly who had been taking portions at night without accounting for them. Coffee was nearly gone. The salt pork was finished. What remained, laid out honestly, was enough to feed 40 people for perhaps 9 days if everyone ate carefully. They were still at least 3 weeks from their next supply point. Lenora looked at what was in front of her for a long time. "The flour," she said. "Can I see it?" Heck opened the barrel. She reached in, pressed her fingers through the clumped gray mass, brought some to her nose, worked it in her palm. It wasn't good, some of it was lost, but not all of it. "I can salvage maybe half," she said. "I'll need to sift it and dry it over heat, and it'll bake strange, but it'll hold together." Heck looked at her. "Half. Half is something. Nothing is nothing." He put his hat back on. "What do you need?" That conversation, right there, was the moment everything shifted. Because what Heck Dodson actually did, without making a ceremony of it, without calling a meeting or asking for a vote, was hand the food problem to a 19-year-old widow who had been cooking for strangers since before her husband's grave had fully settled. He did it because he was pragmatic. And because she was standing there with gray flour on her fingers looking like she already had a plan, and that was more than he had. Lenora took the problem seriously. She inventoried everything. Every bag, every bundle, every strip of anything that could be eaten. She found things people had forgotten they were carrying, a small jar of dried mountain berries belonging to the Hendersons, a cache of wild onions Tamsin had collected over the previous week purely out of habit, 3 cups of cornmeal in a tin at the bottom of the Carlisle wagon that everyone had assumed was empty. She found a sourdough starter in a crockery jar that an older woman named Mrs. Pugh had been maintaining since Missouri like a secret she was ashamed of, because on a wagon train, a sourdough starter was one more thing to keep alive. And people had opinions. "I'll take care of it," Lenora told her. Mrs. Pugh handed it over with the expression of a person releasing something they'd been holding too tightly for too long. Starter was old and sour and complicated, and Lenora loved it immediately. She fed it that night with a small portion of the salvaged flour and set it beside the lowest heat she could manage. In the morning it was alive and bubbling and smelling like something that had endured. She knew exactly how it felt. The sky changed on a Tuesday, or what Heck said was a Tuesday days had blurred together so thoroughly that most people had stopped tracking them. The wind came first, then the temperature dropped in a way that wasn't ordinary cold, but something meaner and more deliberate. Clouds to its windows were dark. The clouds that moved in from the northwest were the wrong color, Too dark, too fast, and Heck stood at the front of the wagon line watching them with the expression of a man recalculating every decision he'd made in the last month. "We need to stop," he said. Not to Lenora specifically. To the air, to himself. But Lenora was the one standing nearest him. "How far to the next shelter?" she asked. "There's a ranch. Blackthorn. Maybe 4 miles." He paused. Rourke Calder's spread. Big operation. He doesn't much welcome strangers. "Are we strangers, or are we people about to freeze to death?" Heck almost smiled. "I'll go ahead and ask." He rode out with 2 of the faster horses. Lenora walked back to the wagons and started organizing people without waiting to hear the answer. She had them consolidate the remaining food into 2 wagons. She had the men check every wheel and axle because she had learned that blizzards did not care about broken wheels, but broken wheels cared a great deal about blizzards. She had Tamsin collect every blanket and piece of wool clothing not currently being worn and stack it in the center wagon for distribution once they stopped moving. Tamsin did all of it without being asked twice. "You knew he was going to come back," and Tamsin said, folding a blanket that had more holes than fabric. "I knew we were going to have to move fast either way," Lenora said. "Better to be ready. What if the rancher says no?" Lenora tied off a bundle of firewood. "Then we deal with that when it happens." What she didn't say, what she refused to say out loud, because she'd learned that spoken fears became amplified. Fears in close quarters was that she was genuinely frightened. Not of the cold, not of the ranch, but of the flour that was running out, and the children who were already quieter than children should be, and the particular mathematics of 9 days of food spread across 3 weeks of need, and how that equation only had one possible ending if nothing changed. She was frightened, and she was exhausted, and her back had ached for 2 weeks from sleeping on a wagon board, and she missed Thomas in ways she wasn't ready yet to put words to. Not yet. But she tied off the wood and moved to the next wagon. There was always something next. Heck came back inside the hour. His expression was the careful neutral of a man delivering news he didn't fully understand. He said yes, Heck told her. The barn. Enough room for the wagons and most of the animals. And the kitchen? Heck paused. "I didn't ask about a kitchen. I'll ask when we get there." The 4 miles took nearly 3 hours, because the wind had started in earnest and the trail was icing underneath the wheels, and 2 wagons had to be pushed by hand over a shallow rise that would have been nothing in August. By the time the first wagon rolled through the gate of Blackthorn Ranch, the snow was coming sideways, and 3 children were crying, and Mrs. Pugh had stopped speaking entirely, which was more alarming than the crying. Lenora was at the back of the line when they came through. She was the last one in. She saw the barn first large, solid, built by someone who intended things to last. She saw the ranch hands emerging from various outbuildings, most of them looking at the arriving wagons with varying degrees of suspicion and resigned practicality. She saw the main house, dark except for one window, and she saw him. Rourke Calder stood in the yard between the barn and the house with his arms crossed and his collar turned up against the wind. He was taller than she expected, with the kind of face that had been weathered into its permanent expression years ago, not unfriendly, exactly, but closed in a way that suggested whatever was behind it had been put away deliberately, and he preferred it to stay there. He was watching the wagons come in. He watched Lenora last. Their eyes met for the length of a breath. She didn't look away. Neither did he. Then he said to nobody and everybody, "Get them into the barn," turned, and walked back to the house without another word. Lenora watched the door close behind him. Then she walked to the nearest ranch hand, a young man with red ears and the look of someone who had not been consulted about any of this, and said, "I need to speak with someone about the kitchen." Stared at her. The kitchen. There are 40 people who haven't had a warm meal in 3 days. Kitchen. Who do I speak to? He opened his mouth, closed it, and pointed at the house. Lenora walked to the front door and knocked. It took long enough that she knocked again. When Rourke Calder opened the door, he did not look pleased. "Kitchen," Lenora said. "I need to use it." He looked at her, at the flower still on her coat sleeve, at the particular expression on her face that was not a request and was not quite a demand, but was something with the weight of both. "For," he said, "to feed 40 people. A pause. "You can cook? I can do more than that." She looked past him into the dark interior of the house. "But I need access to whatever is in there, and I need to not be argued with while I'm working. I don't have time for it." Something crossed his face. She couldn't name it. Surprise, maybe. Or the specific recognition of someone who has met another person operating on the same frequency of pure necessity. He stepped back from the door. The kitchen is through there, he said. I haven't been in it for 2 years. She stepped inside. The cold hit her first, the particular cold of a house that had been heated by habit and not by purpose, where fires were lit in the rooms you used and ignored in the ones you didn't. The kitchen was at the back, and it was dark, and when she found the lamp and lit it, she saw a room that had once been well loved and was now covered in the particular dust of disused equipment in the right places. Everything where it should be, and the unmistakable feeling of a place that had been abandoned mid-sentence. There was cast iron on the hooks. There was a wood stove that looked sound. There was a sourdough crock in the corner empty, dry, long dead. She thought of Mrs. Pugh's living starter in her coat pocket and felt something that was not quite hope, but was its practical neighbor. She took off her coat and hung it on the hook by the door. Then she got to work. The first thing she made that night was a bone broth. She had brought the beef bones from the provisions wagon, the ones most people had overlooked because they were an oddly shaped and required patience to yield anything useful. She cracked them and set them in the largest pot she could find and built the fire up slowly so the heat was even and didn't scorch. She threw in the wild onions Tamsin had collected. She added a small measure of salt carefully, because salt was almost gone, and a dried herb she found in a clay jar on the shelf above the stove that she identified by smell as thyme that had seen better days but still had something left in it. She added the salvaged flour to a separate bowl with a sourdough starter and some water that she'd heated slightly and began the process of persuading it into dough. It was going to be wrong, too dense, probably maybe bitter, but bread was bread when you were hungry enough. She was working the dough when she heard the door. She didn't turn around. "There's nothing in this kitchen worth stealing," she said. "If you're one of the ranch hands checking on me, the answer is I'm fine and I'd appreciate another length of wood for the stove." Silence. She turned. Rourke Calder was standing in the doorway of his own kitchen with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not hostile, not warm. Somewhere in between, watching her work with the dough, watching the pot on the stove, watching the lamp throw yellow light across the room. He said nothing for a moment. "It smells different," he said finally. "I haven't burned anything yet. I didn't mean that." He looked at the stove. "It smells like—" He stopped. Lenora waited. He didn't finish the sentence. He looked at the floor instead, and then back at the stove, and there was something in his face that she understood without needing it explained. The loss of it. The specific grief of a smell that belonged to someone who wasn't there anymore. Turned back to her dough. "There'll be enough for the ranch hands, too," she said, keeping her voice even. "If you want to let them know." He didn't answer immediately. "Then, what do you need?" "Wood. And if there's anything in the cold cellar I should know about. There's root vegetables. Some preserved goods. I'll have someone show you in the morning." "Tonight," she said. He looked at her. "I work better when I know what I have," she said. "I can't plan tomorrow's food if I don't know tonight's inventory." Another pause. The kind of pause that wasn't opposition but calculation. "I'll show you myself," he said. They went to the cold cellar together, Rourke holding the lamp, Lenora moving along the shelves, taking quiet stock of what was there. She didn't touch anything without asking. She noted. She counted. She was already calculating backward from the number of mouths, to the number of days, to the number of meals that number of days required. He watched her do this without interfering. On the way back up the cellar stairs, he said, "How long have you been cooking for them?" "Since the provisions started running low." "About a month. And before that?" "My husband cooked for himself." Cooked alongside him. "I'm sorry," he said. And he said simply, without the careful performance. People sometimes put around condolences, the way you ornament something uncomfortable to make it easier to hand over. She nodded. They came back into the kitchen. The broth was beginning to smell like something real. Rourke stood by the door for a moment. "You should know," he said, "that there are 41 people in my barn, and I have never fed more than 12 at one sitting." "There are 40 now," she said. "We lost Thomas 4 weeks ago." She hadn't meant to say his name. It came out before she could decide against it. She kept her eyes on the pot. 40, Rourke said quietly. 40. He nodded once. He went to the wood stack by the wall and loaded 2 additional lengths into the stove without being asked. adjusting the damper the way someone did when they'd done it 10,000 times without thinking. He left without saying goodnight. Lenora stood in the kitchen alone, with the broth and the lamp and the dough rising under a cloth. The fire crackled. Outside, the blizzard pressed against every wall. Somewhere in the barn, 40 people were cold and hungry and waiting. She shaped the dough into rounds, slid them into the oven, and stayed awake all night, making sure everything was ready. That was the beginning of all of it. And nobody who was there that night ever forgot the smell of that bread coming out of a kitchen that had been dark for 2 years. The bread was gone before sunrise. Not because Lenora had made too little, she had stretched the dough as far as it would go without becoming something that only resembled bread in shape, but because 40 people who had been eating cold, inadequate food for 3 days consumed warm bread the way dry ground consumed rain, completely, without a trace. She stood in the kitchen doorway watching Heck Dodson carry the last pan into the barn, and she did the calculation again in her head the way she'd been doing it since the cold cellars inventory the night before. She did it a third time, hoping the numbers would rearrange themselves into something more cooperative. They didn't. She had enough to feed 40 people for 11 days, if she was careful. 13 if she was extraordinary. The storm showed no intention of stopping, and the mountain pass that connected Blackthorn Ridge to the nearest supply town had already, according to one of Rourke's ranch hands, a weathered man named Gill, who delivered this information with the flat certainty of someone who had watched this particular geography behave badly before drifted shut sometime in the night. 11 days. Maybe 13. She went back inside and started breakfast. Tamsin found her an hour later, appearing in the kitchen doorway with her dark hair loose and her coat missing a button she'd lost 2 weeks ago and never replaced, looking slightly less wary than usual, which was the closest Tamsin got to relaxed. The little Garrett boy, Tamsin said, he's asking for porridge, specifically. He announced it to his grandmother like he was placing an order. How old is he? Maybe 7. Nobody seems entirely certain. Lenora almost smiled. Is there oats in the cellar? A small barrel. Not much. Tell him yes. Tell him it'll be about 30 minutes. Tamsin didn't move immediately. She stood in the doorway, looking at the kitchen, the pots, the fire, the organized chaos of an operation that had taken over someone else's space and made it functional with an expression Lenora had learned to recognize. It was the expression of someone who wanted to ask a question and had not yet decided whether it was safe to do so. What? Lenora said. Can I help? Lenora looked at her for a moment. Tamsinson was 15 and had the hands of someone who had done physical work, but not kitchen work, the kind of hands that were capable but untrained, that would break things through enthusiasm rather than carelessness. Do you know how to stir something without stopping? Lenora asked. I think so. The oats need constant stirring, or they stick and burn. Can you do that for 15 minutes without getting distracted? Tamsin straightened slightly. Yes. Then wash your hands and come here. That was how it started. Not with any speech about teaching or learning or passing things down, but with a pot of oats that needed stirring and a 15-year-old who needed somewhere to put her hands. Lenora showed her the rhythm of it, the way the wooden spoon had to move from the bottom of the pot in a slow circle that kept everything in motion without splashing. She showed her how to tell by sound and smell when the heat was right. She corrected her twice when the rhythm broke and the oats started catching at the edges. Tamsin did not complain about being corrected. That told Lenora more about her than an hour of conversation would have. By the time the porridge was done, Tamsin had also learned, without being explicitly taught, how Lenora organized her workspace, everything she would need within reach before she started, nothing in the way that didn't need to be there, because Lenora had simply worked in that manner while Tamsin was standing next to her, and the girl had watched and quietly rearranged her own small area to match. Smart, Lenora thought. Careful smart, not showy smart. The useful kind. She didn't say any of this out loud. She handed Tamsin the pot and told her to take it to the barn. The ranch hands were a separate problem. There were 7 of them, Gil, who was the oldest and most taciturn, a young man named Cass, who had red ears and the perpetual expression of someone slightly behind on current events, 2 brothers named Ward and Dolan Fitch, who communicated primarily through eyebrow movements, a quiet man called Preacher, whose actual name nobody seemed to know, who read from a small book every evening and said almost nothing, and two seasonal hands named Avery and Moss, who had been snowed in along with everyone else and regarded the entire situation with the resigned tolerance of men accustomed to being the least important people in any given room. They did not precisely object to the wagon train people using the ranch facilities, but they had not been asked, and they lived in a world where being not asked about a thing was functionally the same as being dismissed, and that generated the specific low-grade resentment that expresses itself through silence and avoidance rather than confrontation. Lenora noticed this on the second morning. She noticed it the way she noticed everything, not by looking directly at it, but by registering it in her peripheral awareness, the same way you noticed weather. The ranch hands ate separately from the Wagon train people. They came to the kitchen when it was quiet, took their food without much interaction, and left. They answered questions from the settlers with the bare minimum of words required. They were not rude. They were simply not there, in the way that people sometimes made themselves not there, while still physically occupying a space. She thought about it while she was making the noon meal. Then she did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She made 2 extra portions heaping ones, more than the standard, and took them herself to the barn where Gil and Cass were repairing a wheel brace that one of the wagon train's vehicles had cracked during the last push. She set the plates down on the workbench without saying anything about the portions or the size of them, or the fact that she'd brought them specifically. "I need someone to check the stovepipe on the north side of the house," she said instead. "I think there's a blockage. I can smell it when the wind shifts." Gil looked at the plate, then at her. "I'll look at it after this. Thank you." She started to leave. "Ma'am," Cass said. Turned. He was looking at his plate. There's more here than cold out," she said. "You're working harder than anyone I can see. Eat." She left before he could say anything else. Gil looked at Cass. Cass looked at his food. Neither of them said anything. But after that, when the ranch hands came to the kitchen, they didn't come and go so quickly. They lingered slightly. Not enough to call it socializing. Just enough to call it something other than avoidance. Rourke notes, Lenora didn't know that yet. She first understood that something had changed when she found him in the kitchen. Not the way he'd appeared the first night standing in the doorway, uncertain, pulled in by something he didn't have a name for. This time he was at the table, sitting with a cup of coffee, reading what appeared to be a ledger. He looked up when she came in, registered her presence, and looked back at the ledger. "Pipe on the north side," he said. "Gil fixed it this morning." "I know. I could tell when the smoke cleared. You should have come to me about it." Gil was closer. She went to the stove and checked the pot she'd left simmering. "Is there a problem with that?" A pause. "No." She didn't say anything. She stirred the pot, added a small measure of the time. "Provisions," Rourke said. He set the ledger down. "I've been looking at what's in the cold cellar against what I have in the main stores. I can supplement what you're working with." She turned to look at him. "How much?" "Enough to push your timeline out. By how much depends on how you're rationing. I can show you my numbers." He nodded. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her apron pocket. She had been keeping the inventory on a scrap of paper using a pencil stub she'd found in the kitchen drawer and spread it on the table next to his ledger. They sat across from each other and went through it together. He didn't comment on her system, which was not a formal system at all, but a practical one she'd drawn a grid. Days across the top, meals down the side, with running tallies of what each meal required against what remained. It was not beautiful, it worked. He added his stores to her numbers with the same quiet practicality. When they were done, they sat looking at the result. 3 weeks, she said. Maybe 4 if nothing gets worse. That should be enough, Rourke said. The pass usually clears within 2 weeks of a blow like this. Usually, he agreed. There was a beat of silence. You've been doing this a long time, he said. Cooking for crowds. No, she said honestly. I've been doing it for about a month. He looked at her. A month. Before that, it was just Thomas and me. She folded the paper back up. I learn fast when the alternative is bad. He was quiet for a moment. Where were you headed, Oregon? Thomas wanted Oregon. She stopped. Thought about it genuinely, maybe for the first time since the burial. I wanted somewhere that felt like it could become permanent. I'm not sure Oregon was that. I'm not sure it mattered to me what direction we went, as long as we went together. She hadn't meant to say that much. She looked back at the stove. The soup will be ready in about 2 hours, she said, returning to the practical, which was always safer. If you want some. I'll be here, he said. He picked up his ledger and left. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, then went back to work. The rumors from Briar Hollow arrived like weather. You didn't see them coming, you just found yourself inside them. It started with a rancher named Dole Pritchard, who had ridden out to Blackthorn Ranch on the third day of the storm on what he called a welfare check, and what was actually, by anyone's honest accounting, a curiosity visit. He was a broad man with a loud voice and the particular social confidence of someone who had never been in a room where he wasn't welcomed, and he looked at the 40 settlers in Rourke's barn with an expression that moved through several emotions quickly before settling on something Lenora recognized as performative concern. He found Rourke near the barn. "You're feeding all of them?" Pritchard said, with the specific emphasis on all that contained an entire opinion. "They needed feeding," Rourke said. "Rourke, that's a considerable expense. And for Wagon people, they're people, Dole." Pritchard lowered his voice in the manner of someone about to say something they've decided is too true to say loudly. "I heard you've got a woman running your kitchen." Rourke looked at him steadily. "I've got 40 people running low on food, and one person who knows how to fix that." "Yes, a young widow," Pritchard said, "traveling alone. Traveling with her wagon train. She buried her husband a month ago." "Right, right." Pritchard nodded with the slow theatrical gravity of a man building toward his actual point. "It's just Rourke. People talk. You know how people talk." "I do," Rourke said, "and I generally find it's more a reflection of the people talking than the people being talked about." Pritchard left shortly after. Lenora didn't hear about this conversation until later. She heard about it from Tamsin, who had heard it from Cass, who had been near enough to the barn to catch most of it. By the time it reached Lenora, it had the particular texture of news that had been through several filters and arrived at its destination sharper than it started. Thought about it while she made the evening bread. She thought about it, and then she set it aside, because she had 40 people to feed, and whatever Dole Pritchard thought about her circumstances was not an ingredient she could use for anything. But it was the first signal, and she recognized signals. The name Sabine Crowell came to her in pieces. The first piece was from Mrs. Hendricks, one of the settler women, who mentioned it without any particular intent to inform just the casual passing of information. The way women in close quarters passed everything, like salt. "That woman who sends baskets at Christmas," she said. "The merchant's widow. Sabine something. She apparently has strong opinions about the ranchers in this valley." The second piece was from Gil. He said it with his face pointed at the harness he was mending and his voice carefully neutral. "She's been coming out here regular, before all this. For about 2 years. Rourke always has somewhere else to be when she visits." Lenora processed this. "Is that his business or hers?" she said. Gil almost smiled. "That's the question, isn't it?" She didn't ask anything else. The third piece arrived in the form of a note, delivered to the ranch by a boy on a horse who clearly had instructions to leave quickly, which he did. One of the ranch hands brought it to Rourke. He read it with the expression of a man identifying a familiar problem and setting it to the side of his desk where it could wait. Lenora didn't see the note, but she saw his expression when he came into the kitchen that evening, and she had been reading expressions long enough to know that something had complicated. "Something wrong," she said. He looked at her as though deciding something. "Sabine Crowell is hosting a winter banquet for the valley. She's invited most of the ranch families." Lenora turned back to her pot. "That's considerate of her. She has her reasons." He sat down at the table. "She does most things for reasons. Most people do." He was quiet for a moment. "She's been talking about you, in Briar Hollow." Lenora set the spoon down, turned. "What's she saying?" Rourke met her eyes directly, which she had come to understand was his way of showing respect. He didn't soften things by looking away. "That you're a penniless widow who attached herself to my household for shelter and is maintaining the attachment through." He paused. Through the kitchen. The silence in the room lasted several seconds. Lenora picked up the spoon and turned back to the pot. "She's not entirely wrong about the penniless part," she said. "Lenora, I have $14 and a sourdough starter," she said, keeping her voice level. "I'm not going to pretend that's wealth." She stirred the pot. "Is it causing problems for you? The talk?" "It's causing me irritation," he said, "which is different." You don't have to explain yourself to anyone on my account. I know I don't. A pause. That's not what's irritating me. She glanced over her shoulder at him. He was looking at the table with an expression she was beginning to be able to read, not the closed-off expression of the first night, but the specific compression of a man who had more to say than he knew how to say yet. She didn't push. She served him soup and sat down across from him, and they ate in the specific companionable silence that had developed over 10 days of shared meals and provisional conversations not comfortable exactly, because nothing between them was quite comfortable, but functional. The silence of two people who had learned they didn't have to fill every space with words. He helped her wash the bowls after. He'd been doing that for 5 days, without comment. The storm broke on the 11th day. Not all at once, weather never apologized cleanly, but the wind dropped first. Then the snow thinned to a spit. Then the sky on the western edge began to show a color that was not quite gray and not quite blue, but was moving in the right direction. By mid-morning, Gil confirmed that the pass might be passable within 3 days if the temperature held. The wagon train people received this news with the complex emotion of people who had been somewhere long enough to feel both grateful and slightly reluctant. The settlers began making preparations to continue west. Wheels were checked, provisions recounted, animals assessed. The barn, which had been a compressed community for 11 days, began the slow process of dissolving back into separate groups with separate destinations. Lenora kept cooking. She would keep cooking until the last wagon cleared the gate, because that was the job. The job didn't end because the crisis was technically resolving. Tamsin helped her every day now. It had become understood without being formalized. Tamsin was in the kitchen at first light, and they worked together through the morning and into the afternoon, and somewhere in that time, Tamsin had gone from learning to things without burning them to learning to adjust seasoning by smell, to understanding the difference between heat that cooked something and heat that killed it, to reading the sourdough starter like a mood rather than a formula. She was good. Not skilled yet, not technically, but she had the instinct, which was the thing you couldn't teach if it wasn't already there. One afternoon, most of its windows were dark, while Tamsin was making the bread rounds with the confidence of someone who had done it 100 times rather than a dozen. Lenora watched her and felt something she was not prepared for, particular warmth of watching a younger person discover what they were capable of. It had nothing to do with Thomas, and everything to do with the fact that Lenora had spent 11 days pouring herself into the work of keeping people alive, and had somehow, without planning it, started pouring some of that into a person rather than just into food. She didn't say anything about it, but she did, quietly and without ceremony, show Tamsin the sourdough starter the real lesson. Not just the mechanics of it, but the understanding of what made it alive. How to feed it, how to read it, how to bring it back when it was struggling. It just needs attention, Tamsin said, watching the starter. Most things do, Lenora said. Tamsin looked at her. 17 things were happening in that look, none of them spoken. Lenora handed her a spoon, more than the usual amount today. Cold, and it needs help. The night before the wagon train was scheduled to move, Rourke came to the kitchen later than usual. The settlers had done their best attempt at a celebration. Someone had produced a fiddle, and there had been dancing in the barn that Lenora could hear from the kitchen, and she had sent extra bread out for it and told Tamsin to go join them, which Tamsin had done with a degree of reluctance that suggested she'd wanted to be asked rather than volunteered. The kitchen was quiet. The fire was low. Lenora was cleaning the cast iron, which was the kind of task she did at the end of long days because it required attention without requiring thought, and she was very tired. Rourke sat down. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Where will you go when they leave?" She set the iron down. She had been thinking about this question in the background of everything for the last 3 days, turning it over while she worked, examining it from different angles the way you examined a thing, in low light, circling it because looking directly at it was difficult. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Oregon? I don't think Oregon was ever really mine." She picked up the iron again, kept her hands busy. "Thomas had a brother there. I have no one there. And behind you? Nothing to go back to." She said it without self-pity. Fact. "My family was small. We were the beginning of something, Thomas and I. Not the middle of something I could return to." Rourke was quiet. "You could stay," he said. She stopped moving. The fire crackled. That's... She looked at him. He was looking at the table with that compressed expression again, the one that meant more than it showed. I cook for people, Rourke. I can't offer you anything in exchange for. I'm not making an exchange, he said. I'm asking if you want to stay. Why? He looked up. Not the quick, deflective look of someone checking whether their words landed the direct, slight uncomfortable look of a man who was unused to saying things like this and was saying them anyway, because not saying them had become worse than saying them. Because this house has been empty for 3 years, he said, and for 11 days it hasn't been. And I didn't expect to, he stopped. Looked at the fire. Looked back at her. I don't know how to say this without it sounding like something it isn't. What is it? She said. I don't know yet, he said plainly, but I'd like to have time to find out, if you would. The fiddle music drifted in from the barn. Someone was playing something fast and slightly off-key, and people were laughing. Lenora looked at the iron in her hands. She thought about Oregon, which had never been hers. She thought about Thomas, who had been hers and was gone. She thought about the kitchen she was sitting in, which had been dark for 3 years and was now lit, and the 40 people in the barn who would leave in the morning, and the 15-year-old in the barn who was, for the first time in months, dancing. I don't know either, she said. That's fair, he said. Think about it. He nodded. He stood and he took his coffee cup to the basin and set it there, and he paused at the door. For what it's worth, he said, the ranch hands have started showing up to meals earlier than they need to. I thought you should know. She looked at him. Is that a good sign? From Gil, it's remarkable. She almost laughed. He almost smiled. He went to bed. She sat with the fire for a while longer, turning the thought over, not deciding, not yet, just holding it up to look at, asking herself what it would mean to stop moving. What it would mean to choose a direction not because someone else had pointed her there, but because she had looked at the train and thought, this is worth trying. She was still thinking about it when she heard the fiddle finally stop and the barn go quiet. She cleaned the last pot. She went to bed. She did not have an answer. But for the first time since Missouri, the question itself didn't feel like something being done to her. It felt like something she was allowed to consider. The wagon train left on a cold, clear morning. Heck Dodson shook Rourke's hand at the gate, said something Lenora couldn't hear, and looked at her with an expression she understood as both farewell and permission, as though he knew something about her decision before she did. The Garrett boy, who was possibly 6 and possibly 7, ran back from his grandmother's wagon at the last minute and pressed something into Lenora's hand before running back. She looked down. It was a small, smooth stone. She had no idea what it meant to him or why he'd chosen to give it to her, and that made it more valuable than almost anything she owned. She put it in her pocket. She stood at the gate and watched the wagons roll through. Tamsin stood next to her, not in the line of wagons. Next to her. She hadn't discussed it. She'd simply positioned herself beside Lenora at the gate and was watching the wagons go with the expression of someone who has quietly made a decision and is waiting to see whether anyone will object. Lenora looked at her. Tamsin looked back with those dark, watchful eyes and said nothing. You'd have to work, Lenora said, actually work. In the kitchen and out of it, I know. And go to school if there's one in Briar Hollow. Tamsin made a face that was the closest she got to open complaint. Non-negotiable, Lenora said. Tamsin looked at the retreating wagons. Fine. They stood together and watched the last wagon roll through the gate and start down the trail toward the pass. The sound of it diminished by degrees the creak of the wheels, the voices, the particular living noise of 40 people moving together until the valley was quiet again, and the only things in it were the ranch buildings, the animals, the seven ranch hands going about their morning work. One rancher, who was looking at her from near the barn, with the specific patience of a man who had decided to wait for an answer and was not going to rush it, and 2 women who had been through enough together in 11 days to constitute something like a family. Lenora turned away from the gate. There was food to make for lunch. She went to make it. That was not a small decision. That was all of it. But the valley was not done with Lenora Vance. She had 3 days of relative peace, 3 days of learning the rhythm of the ranch, without the urgency of 40 people to feed, figuring out where things belonged and how Rourke's household actually functioned when it was not in crisis mode, before the news arrived from Briar Hollow. It came through the same network that all small valley news traveled, obliquely, with embellishment, arriving slightly garbled but accurate in its essential ugliness. Sabine Crowell had held a small gathering in Briar Hollow. A dinner, by the sound of it, something between a social occasion and a tribunal. Several of the valley's respectable families had been present: the Pritchards, the Holloway Dawsons, a widow named Mrs. Fett, who controlled a great deal of the valley's opinion, without anyone quite acknowledging that she did. And at this dinner, Sabine had been, according to Cass, who had heard it from the Pritchard stable boy, who had been serving that evening, descriptive. She had described Lenora as a wandering widow who had inserted herself into a grieving man's household through the most ancient and reliable of calculations, making herself indispensable before making herself permanent. She had described the kitchen arrangement as a deliberate campaign rather than a practical necessity. She had described Lenora's cooking for the ranch hands as something she called, and this was the part that stayed with Lenora because of its specific cruelty strategic performance for an audience of one. The audience of one being Rourke. Cass reported all of this to Gil. Gil reported it to Rourke. Rourke came into the kitchen while Lenora was teaching Tamsin how to cure a cast iron pan that had developed a rough patch. He stood in the doorway. His jaw was set in a particular way. "I'm going to Briar Hollow," he said. Lenora looked at him. "No," she said. He stared. "No. You go into that town angry on my behalf," she said, keeping her voice even, "and every word Sabine Crowell has said about me becomes the explanation for your behavior. You become a man defending a woman who manipulated him. That's the story people will tell." He said nothing. "I don't need defending," she said. "I need to not be the reason you do something that makes your life harder. She called you, I know what she called me." She set the pan down. "I've been called variations of it since I was a child. Poor. Insufficient. Not enough of something. I'm still here." She looked at him steadily. "What she thinks of me doesn't determine what I am. I'd appreciate it if you remembered that before you ride into town to prove her point." Rourke stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he sat down. He said nothing for a while. Tamsin, to her credit, found a reason to be very busy with the pan in the far corner of the kitchen. "You're not angry," he said finally. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm angry," she said. "I'm also practical. There's a difference between feeling something and letting it make your decisions for you." He looked at her with an expression she was getting better at reading, not just the surface of it, the compression and the restraint, but the thing beneath it. The specific frustration of a man who had been living alone with his own thoughts for 3 years and had not recently been offered the experience of being understood by another person. "Fine," he said. "Thank you. I still think someone should say something to her." "Someone will," Lenora said. "Eventually. The right someone at the right time, in the right way." She picked the pan back up and went back to work. "That's not today, and it's probably not you." He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, almost under his breath, 3 years I've run this ranch alone, and nobody told me what to do." Lenora glanced at Tamsin. Tamsin was very carefully not smiling. "You're not being told what to do," Lenora said. "You're being asked to be patient." She handed him a cup of coffee. "There's a difference." He took the coffee. He stayed and drank it. And Sabine Crowell's invitation to the winter banquet arrived, 2 days later, addressed to Rourke Calder alone, with no mention of anyone else at the ranch. The exclusion was so deliberate it was almost elegant. Lenora read it when Rourke held it out to her, not hiding it, not managing what she knew, which she had noticed was his way, and she set it down and thought about what it meant. What it meant was that Sabine Crowell had decided to stop talking about Lenora and start acting. What it meant was that the next part was going to be harder. What it meant, though Lenora did not say this out loud, was that she had not yet faced the real test. Everything so far had been winter, had been survival, had been the kind of difficulty that was hard but at least made sense. You were cold, you were hungry, you worked until you weren't. What was coming was different. What was coming was the kind of thing that couldn't be solved with a soup pot and a sourdough starter. Or so Sabine Crowell believed. She did not know Lenora Vance very well. She was about to. Rourke set the invitation on the kitchen table and left it there for 2 days without saying what he intended to do about it. Lenora noticed. She noticed the way she noticed most things in that house, now peripherally, without making an event of it. The invitation sat between the salt jar and the lamp, like a small declaration of war that everyone was pretending was just paper. On the third morning, she moved it to the edge of the table so she had room to work. On the third evening, Rourke picked it up, looked at it, and said, "I'm going." Lenora stirred the pot. "All right, you're coming with me." She stopped stirring. She turned slowly and looked at him. He was standing, with the invitation in one hand and his coffee in the other, and he had the expression of a man who had made a decision in the private hours of several consecutive nights, and was now presenting it as a simple statement of fact, which was either confidence or stubbornness, and was probably both. "Rourke," she said carefully, "the invitation is addressed to you alone. I'm aware. She didn't include me deliberately. I'm aware of that too. So walking in there with me beside you is what I intend to do," he said, "unless you're telling me you don't want to go." She looked at him for a long moment, at the invitation, at the careful blankness of his expression, which she had learned was not absence of feeling but the specific face he wore when feeling was present and strong, and he decided to hold it in place with both hands. "I'm telling you it will cause problems," she said. "It'll cause her a problem," he said. "That's different. And the rest of the valley? The merchants and ranchers, and the Pritchard family and Mrs. Fett and everyone else she's invited who already thinks I know what they think." His voice was even. "I also know what's true. And I've spent 3 years in this valley keeping my head down and my opinions to myself, and I find I'm less interested in continuing that than I was." She looked at him. He looked back. The fire did what it always did. Crackled, settled, breathed. "What am I wearing?" she said finally. Something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, he didn't do those easily, but the compression loosened slightly, like a knot that had been pulled tight for too long, and was only now remembering it didn't have to be. "I'll have something sent from the dry goods in Briar Hollow," he said. "You don't have to, I know I don't have to." She turned back to the pot. She stirred it twice, set the spoon down, picked it back up. "One condition," she said. "What?" "If it goes badly, if people are cruel in that particular quiet way, that's worse than loudness, we leave. No argument. We just leave." "Agreed," he said immediately. "Then, after a beat, and if it goes the other way, then we stay as long as you want," she said. "And I'll try not to say I told you so." "You won't tell me you told me so," he said, "because it won't go badly." He said it with the absolute groundless certainty of a man who had decided something was going to be true and was committing to it entirely, which was either admirable or foolish and was probably both. She did not tell him this. She served dinner. The dress arrived 2 days before the banquet, packed in brown paper and tied with a cord, sent by a woman at the dry goods store named Mrs. Averley, who, according to the note tucked inside, had been told only that it was for a tall young woman with no existing occasion clothes and a practical build. Mrs. Averley had interpreted this correctly. The dress was dark green wool, well made without being extravagant, with a collar that was respectable without being frilly, and it fit the way clothes fit when someone had actually thought about the body inside them rather than the garment itself. Tamsin held it up. "It's nice," she said, with the careful neutrality of someone delivering a verdict they know is incomplete. "Practical," Lenora said. "It's also nice." Tamsin tilted her head. "You should wear your hair differently." "I wear my hair in a braid because I'm in a kitchen." "You won't be in a kitchen." "I'm always somewhat in a kitchen." Tamsin set the dress down with the patience of someone who understood that this particular argument would resolve itself eventually and didn't need to be pushed. She had developed this quality over the weeks at Blackthorn Ranch. This ability to identify when Lenora was resisting, something she'd already decided to accept, and to simply wait it out. It was, Lenora thought, a very useful quality in a 15-year-old. Possibly in anyone. She wore her hair differently. The night of the banquet was cold and clear, the stars very bright, the way they were after storms. The road into Briar Hollow hard-packed and dry enough for the wagon to move quickly. Rourke drove. He had put on a dark jacket and a clean hat and had shaved, which was not unusual, but he'd done it with extra care, which was, Zotsets, Lenora sat beside him on the bench, and neither of them spoke much for the first mile, which was comfortable rather than strained the particular companionship of people who had shared enough ordinary moments to not need words for all of them. The second mile, Lenora said, "Tell me who'll be there." He told her. He was precise about it, in the way he was precise about everything the Pritchards, Dole and his wife Harriet, who was smarter than her husband and less interested in performing it, the Holloway Dawsons, who were wealthy and careful and watched the direction of social weather before committing to any position. Old Judge Carver, who had been in the valley since before most people and had opinions about everything and the authority to express them. Mrs. Fett, who had never been elected to anything and had never needed to be, and probably a dozen others. Valley families, the kind that owned things and had opinions about people who didn't. And Sabine's, Lenora said. Sabine, he confirmed. Tell me about her. He was quiet for a moment. Her husband was Aldous Crowell. He ran the main mercantile in Briar Hollow, did importing, had agreements with half the ranchers in the valley. He died 4 years ago. She took over the business and ran it well better than he did, honestly, though nobody says that out loud, because she's a woman and it makes people uncomfortable. He paused. She has money. She has money and she has influence, and she's been accustomed to both for long enough that she's stopped distinguishing between having them and deserving them. Did you ever? Lenora started, then stopped.
No, Rourke said,
without waiting for the full question. She thought we would. I never agreed with her about that. Did you tell her that? Several times. In those words? A pause. In words I thought were clear. Lenora looked at the road ahead. Men often believe they're being clear when they're being polite. He turned to look at her briefly. You're saying I'm responsible for her expectations. I'm saying that if you were not clear, and she built expectations on what she believed was politeness, then you are not entirely innocent of contributing to this situation. She kept her tone even, factual, not accusatory. That doesn't make her behavior reasonable. It just makes the situation more complicated than pure villainy. He was quiet for a while. That's an uncomfortable thing to hear, he said. I imagine it is. Another pause. You're not wrong. I know, she said, and then, because that had come out with more edge than she intended, I'm sorry. That was blunter than it needed to be. I prefer blunt, he said. I've had enough of careful. She looked at him. In the dark and cold of the wagon bench, with the stars overhead and the lights of Briar Hollow beginning to appear at the edge of the horizon, he looked less like the closed and weathered rancher she had met in a snowstorm, and more like a man who was slowly and with some difficulty remembering how to be a person rather than just a function. She thought of the kitchen, the cold cellar, the 2 years of dust. She thought of how much you could lose without moving an inch. We're almost there, he said. Yes, she said. She straightened her back. She was ready. The Crowell house was the largest private building in Briar Hollow, not a mansion by any standard that would have meant something in the East, but in this valley it was substantial, with a wide front porch and lit windows, and the smell of expensive things cooking drifting out into the cold air from 50 yards away. Carriages were already lined along the road. Horses stood at the rail with their breath steaming. The sound of voices and music came through the walls, the particular sound of a gathering that had been organized by someone who understood that the right details made people feel they were at an event rather than just a dinner. Sabine Crowell understood this very well. Rourke helped Lenora down from the wagon with a steadiness that was neither demonstrative nor casual, but something between. He held her hand until she was on the ground, and he didn't let go immediately after, and she was aware of the warmth of it in a way she was not going to think about right now. She smoothed her green dress. She walked to the door. He knocked. The man who opened it was a hired hand serving as a doorman for the evening, which told Lenora something about the level of production involved. He looked at Rourke with recognition. He looked at Lenora with a carefully neutral expression that was working very hard to conceal surprise. Calder, he said, Mrs. Crowell is expecting you. Good, Rourke said. We'll go on in. The we landed like a stone in water. The man's expression shifted by a fraction. He stepped back. They went in. The room was warm and smelled of pine boughs and roasting meat, and something imported a perfume or a candle or the particular combination of ingredients that money reliably produced when it applied itself to hospitality. There were perhaps 30 people already present, gathered in clusters, and the room had the organized aesthetic of someone who thought about where things went and why, which in this context Lenora recognized as a form of control. She had walked into rooms before where everything was arranged to make certain people feel smaller. She noted this, filed it away, and looked for the food. There was a great deal of it. A long table along one wall carried dishes that had been imported, prepared, arranged with the specific intent of displaying abundance. Lenora cataloged them automatically. The way she cataloged all food, not with envy but with professional assessment. The imported preserves, the pastries that required refined flour not available locally, the cuts of meat that spoke of access to supply routes that most of the valley didn't have. It was all technically impressive. It was also, she thought, very much food assembled to be looked at. She didn't say this to anyone. She smiled at a woman she didn't know who looked at her with the particular confusion of someone trying to place a face against an expectation and failing. Then Sabine Crowell found them. She was not what Lenora had imagined, which was always the problem with imagining people before meeting them. She had pictured someone overtly cruel-faced, someone whose intentions would be visible on her surface. What she found instead was a woman of perhaps 45, handsome, in the way that competence made people handsome, dressed impeccably in dark burgundy, with the posture of someone who had never once been in a room where she was not the most significant person and had no framework for what to do when that changed. She came toward them with a smile that was real in its muscles and not in its eyes. "Rourke," she said warmly, exactly as warmly as someone who had practiced warmth. "I'm so glad you came, Sabine," he said. "Thank you for the invitation." Her eyes moved to Lenora. They did a very fast and very comprehensive assessment of her, the green dress, the hair, the flower that was no longer on her hands, but whose absence she had clearly noted, and the smile remained unchanged in a way that required considerable skill. "And this is Sabine," began. "Lenora Vance," Rourke said. "She's been staying at the ranch, of course." Sabine extended her hand. "We've heard so much about you, Mrs. Vance." "I imagine you have," Lenora said pleasantly, and shook the hand. Something moved very briefly across Sabine's face. Recalibration. She had expected perhaps uncertainty, apology, the specific shrinking that people sometimes did when they knew they'd been discussed and not kindly. Lenora did none of those things. She held Sabine's hand for exactly as long as was appropriate, let go, and looked at the room with the genuine interest of someone who found most situations worth paying attention to. Sabine recovered smoothly. "Let me introduce you to some of the Valley families," she said, and her eyes moved to Lenora with the particular deliberateness of someone who had just changed her plan. "Rourke, I believe Judge Carver wanted a word with you about the spring grazing agreements. You don't mind if I borrow him for a moment, Mrs. Vance?" Lenora looked at Rourke. Rourke looked at Sabine with an expression that said he understood exactly what was happening. "I'll find you in a moment," he told Lenora. She nodded. Sabine's led him away, and Lenora was left standing alone at a party she hadn't been invited to in a room full of people who had been given specific opinions about her, wearing a green dress that was the nicest thing she currently owned. She went to look at the food table. She was not hiding. She was assessing. She looked at the imported pastries, at the preserved fruit from somewhere south, at the centerpiece cake that had been constructed with the kind of architectural ambition that prioritized appearance over what it would actually be like to eat. She tasted one of the small pastries carefully, with the specific attention she gave all food, and found it technically accomplished, sweet and strangely empty. "You're the cook," said a voice beside her. She turned. A short, older woman with iron-gray hair and the expression of someone who had stopped performing social pleasantries, approximately 30 years ago, was standing beside her. Most of its windows were dark, helping herself to the preserved fruit with the frankness of someone who had been invited and was going to enjoy the food, regardless of the social currents. "I cook," Lenora said. "Among other things, Mrs. Fett," the woman said, not extending her hand, but inclining her head. "I've heard Rourke Calder's ranch hands eat better now than they have in 3 years." "That's not a high bar," Lenora said honestly. They were eating badly. Mrs. Fett made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was its functional cousin. "What do you think of this?" She gestured at the table. Lenora considered whether to be diplomatic. She decided it wasn't worth it. "It's impressive," she said, in the way that things assembled to be impressive usually are. Mrs. Fett looked at her with the specific, sharp attention of someone recalibrating, and not in other ways. "The pastry is accomplished. The cake will be dry inside. You can tell by the way the surface cracked. The preserved fruit is good because preserving fruit well is mostly just patience and the right jar, and someone has had both." Lenora paused. "The arrangement of it is doing a great deal of work that the food itself hasn't been asked to do." Mrs. Fett considered this. "You do it differently," she said. "I do it honestly," Lenora said. "Different isn't always better. Honest usually is." Mrs. Fett looked at her for a long moment with an expression that Lenora couldn't immediately read. Then she nodded once, as though concluding something, and moved further along the table. It was not an endorsement. It was also not an endorsement. Lenora filed it away. Sabine found her again 40 minutes later. By that point, Lenora had spoken to the Pritchards. Harriet Pritchard was, as Rourke had said, perceptive, and had asked several genuinely curious questions about the wagon train before her husband had edged her away. She had spoken briefly with 2 ranch wives, whose names she'd committed to memory because that was the kind of thing that mattered. And she had watched Rourke across the room conducting himself in the steady, unremarkable way he conducted himself everywhere. Speaking when spoken to, listening when not, making no performance of his presence. He had looked at her 3 times. She had looked back twice. The 3rd time she was talking to a merchant's wife and couldn't without being rude about it. So she didn't, and by the time she looked again, he was somewhere else. Sabine came to her side with a refreshed smile and a glass of something. "Mrs. Vance," she said, "I hope you're finding the evening enjoyable." "Very much," Lenora said. "You've made it beautiful." Sabine studied her, looking for the irony. Lenora gave her none. Because there was none, it was beautiful. The arrangement of it, the care taken. Being honest about one thing didn't require being dishonest about another. "I understand you've been quite helpful at Blackthorn Ranch," Sabine said, and the word helpful landed the way she'd intended it, slightly small, functional, the kind of word you used for a reliable tool. "I've been doing what I know how to do," Lenora said. "Cooking," Sabine said. "Feeding people," Lenora said. "It's related but not identical." Sabine's smile maintained itself. "Of course. Still, it must have been a relief to find a warm place to stop, after everything you'd been through. The trail, your husband." She let the pause sit. "Rourke has always been generous with those who need something from him, and there it was." The specific construction of it was almost elegant, wrapping the implication in sympathy, in gentleness, in the vocabulary of concern, so that the insult arrived dressed as care. You needed something. He gave it. That is the entire nature of this arrangement. Lenora looked at her. She took a breath. She thought about what she had said to Rourke weeks ago, that a person's contempt didn't determine your worth, and she refused to let it. She thought about it, and she held on to it, and she did not say the 7 things she could have said. "That's very kind of you, to think of him as generous," Lenora said instead. "He is. But generosity is a choice. It requires something from the person who practices it. Not everyone does." The implication was gentle. It landed where she intended. Sabine's eyes sharpened. "The valley has been watching," Sabine said, and the warmth had thinned, just slightly. "People have questions about the nature of your arrangement with Rourke. It's natural, given everything. A young woman alone. A man in his position. People can have whatever questions they like," Lenora said. "I generally find that people who spend a great deal of time questioning other people's arrangements haven't yet found one of their own worth keeping." The silence between them lasted exactly 2 seconds. It was a very full 2 seconds. Then Sabine Crowell, who had not built what she had by losing her composure in semi-public settings, smiled a different smile now, thinner, more honest, and said, "You're not what I expected." "I rarely am," Lenora said pleasantly. Then Sabine turned to address the room at large, raising her voice with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times, and said, "Shall we talk about hospitality? I've been so looking forward to this evening, the chance to share with our valley what true abundance looks like, not survival." She let the word hang. Actual refinement. The kind that takes years, and resources, and breeding, to learn. She was speaking to the room. She was speaking to Lenora. The room listened. Some of them the Holloway Dawsons. The Pritchard husband nodded with the comfortable agreement of people who had never needed to question whether they belonged to the category being praised. Some of them Harriet Pritchard, Mrs. Fett, a young ranch wife in the back, went slightly still. Rourke, across the room, had stopped mid-conversation. His expression had gone very flat. Lenora felt something harden in her chest. Not anger exactly, something quieter and more durable than anger. The specific weight of a part person who has been publicly diminished and must decide, in real time, what kind of woman they are going to be about it. Could walk out. She had said to Rourke, "If people are cruel, we leave." And this was cruel, delivered in expensive packaging with impeccable diction. She could walk out. She looked at the food table, at the imported pastries and the architectural cake and the arranged abundance that was, she had correctly identified, doing a great deal of work that the food itself had not been asked to do. She looked at the kitchen door. She walked toward it instead of toward the exit. Sabine watched her go with the particular satisfaction of a person who believes they have just won a thing. She was wrong about that. The kitchen was smaller than Blackthorn's but better stocked, which made sense given who owned it. Lenora moved through it quickly, touching, assessing, opening things. 2 hired cooks looked at her with the alarm of people whose territory had been entered without notice. "I need," Lenora said, "flour, butter, whatever fruit you have, molasses, and your best tin pan. I'm making a pie." The older of the 2 cooks stared. "Ma'am, this kitchen is I know whose kitchen it is." Lenora found the flour herself, ran her fingers through it, approved. "She can throw me out if she chooses. Until she does, I'm making a pie. Are you going to help me or watch me?" A pause. The younger cook moved to get the fruit. It wasn't permission. It was the specific human response to someone who moved with enough certainty that stopping them required more commitment than most people had in the moment. Lenora worked fast. She had made pie crust in every condition the frontier offered with bad flour, with butter going rancid, no butter at all, and lard that was mostly salt. And she made it now with good ingredients, and the speed of someone who had done it 1,000 times without the luxury of doing it slowly. The dough came together under her hands with the particular immediacy of things that work the way they're supposed to. She found dried windows were dark. She found dried mountain berries in a crock on the high shelf. Someone had preserved them last fall, and they'd been put away and forgotten, and they had the concentrated sweetness of fruit that had spent a season becoming more itself. She found preserved apple slices. She added molasses, a measure of the spices the kitchen had in abundance, cinnamon, a hint of something she identified as dried ginger, and worked it together. She did not make it perfect. She made it honest. She crimped the edge the way her mother had taught her, not with a fork, not with a spoon, but with her thumb pressed at an angle, a small, imperfect ridge that held together without performing. She put it in the oven she'd already gotten to temperature. By the time the younger cook thought to ask how she knew where the damper was. "I looked at it when I came in," Lenora said. She waited. The kitchen smelled within 20 minutes the way frontier kitchens smelled when they were doing what they were designed for. She carried the pie out herself. The room was in the middle of Sabine's speech about the importance of cultivated hospitality when Lenora walked back through the kitchen door, carrying a pie on a plain tin plate. The smell arrived before she did. It was not the smell of imported ingredients arranged with skill. It was the smell of something simple made with complete attention. The fruit concentrated and warm, the pastry buttered and just short of golden, the molasses giving it a depth that cut through the sweetness and grounded it somewhere real. It was the smell of a winter kitchen on a cold night when someone inside it cared about the people who were going to eat. The room reacted before anyone decided to react. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Someone near the table made a sound that was not exactly appropriate for a formal social occasion, but was entirely honest. Lenora set the pie on the table. She cut it. She served a slice to Mrs. Fett first, because Mrs. Fett was standing nearest, and because Lenora had already decided she was the most honest person in the room. Mrs. Fett tasted it. She looked at Lenora. "What's in it?" she said. "Mountain berries, preserved apple, molasses, and 2 spices." Lenora paused, and attention. Mrs. Fett took another bite. She said nothing else, but she stayed at the table. And then the thing happened that Lenora had not planned and Sabine had not anticipated, and the room had not prepared itself, for people tasted it. 1 slice became 5. 5 became a dozen. The hired hands who came to clear things away paused at the table. A merchant who had been holding an untouched pastry set it down. A rancher's wife asked quietly if there was more, and there wasn't, and she looked genuinely disappointed in the way that people looked when something real had briefly been available and was now finished. Sabine's elaborate dessert stood largely untouched. Sabine herself stood very still near the fireplace with an expression she was controlling with visible effort. Lenora stood at the table and cut the last slices and did not look at Sabine and did not look triumphant, because this was not triumph. It was just food. It was just the particular alchemy of simple things treated with honesty, which was something Lenora had believed in since before she had words for it. Rourke peered beside her. "You baked a pie," he said. "I did. In Sabine Crowell's kitchen. It seemed like the right space to use." He looked at the table, at the empty tin plate, at the largely untouched imported desserts, at the room full of people who were still talking about the smell, the taste, the particular something or other they couldn't name. "I have something to say," he said. Rourke to the room. He said it quietly, firmly. "I have something to say, and I've decided to say it." She looked at him, at the compressed expression which was not compressed tonight, or rather, it was compressing something different, not race, intention. She stepped back. He turned to the room. He didn't raise his voice. Rourke Calder was not a man who raised his voice, because he had never needed to in order to be heard. He simply spoke with the specific weight of someone who chose his words without waste, and the room recognized this and went quiet. "Most of you know me," he said. "Some of you have known me for years. You knew my wife. You knew how things were after I lost her." He paused. "I'm not going to make a speech, but I want to say one thing about Lenora Vance, because I've sat quiet long enough while other people said their piece, and I'm done being quiet." The room was absolutely still. Sabine had not moved. 6 weeks ago, Rourke said, "I opened my barn to 40 strangers because a blizzard was coming, and there was nothing else to do. What I didn't plan for was a 19-year-old widow who walked into a kitchen that had been dark for 2 years and started feeding people with what amounted to almost nothing." He looked at the empty pie plate. She kept 40 people alive through 3 weeks of the worst weather this valley has seen in a decade. Not because she had resources, because she knew how to look at what was in front of her and see something possible. He paused again. Wealth didn't do that. Refinement didn't do that. Breeding didn't do that. He looked at Sabine now, directly, without hostility but without apology. She did that. And she did something else that I didn't expect and that I find I'm no longer willing to not acknowledge in public. The silence was total. "She brought my house back," he said simply. "I didn't know it needed it until she did." He stopped talking. He was not, Lenora thought, a man who knew how to end a speech with ceremony, and so he simply stopped, and the room sat with it, and the fire crackled, and outside the winter night pressed against the windows. Then Sabine said, from across the room, her voice precise and thin as wire, how convenient for her. "Lenora never pursued me," Rourke said. He turned to look at her, at Lenora, and his expression was the open one, the one she had seen perhaps 3 times, and had learned meant he had decided to stop holding something back. "I chose her. That's the distinction." The room held very still. Lenora's chest did something she was not going to think about in a public setting. Mrs. Fett, in the corner, made that sound again, that was not quite a laugh. Harriet Pritchard looked at her husband with an expression that communicated a great deal. Sabine Crowell stood very straight and very still, with the controlled expression of a woman who had built her life on knowing how rooms worked and had just watched one stop working the way she expected. She said nothing else. Rourke looked at Lenora. Lenora looked at the empty pie plate. She looked at the room, at the 30 faces in various states of recalibration, at the untouched imported desserts, pine boughs and the expensive candles, and the elaborate staging of an evening that had just been quietly and completely redirected by a tin plate and a handful of dried mountain berries, and one man saying a true thing in front of people who needed to hear it. She was not certain what came next. She was not certain what she felt. Exactly too many things at once, pressing against each other, not sorting themselves into anything clean or simple. Relief. Something warmer than relief. Anger still, at the edge of it, because she was still a person who had been publicly diminished by someone who thought her worth could be defined by her bank balance and her route of travel. But beneath all of it, bedrock, the knowledge that she was still standing. She had walked into this room in a green wool dress with flour no longer on her hands, and she had not flinched, and she had not shrunk, and she had not let anyone tell her what she was. She had made a pie. It had been a very good pie. She reached out and moved the empty tin plate to the edge of the table. Then she picked up Rourke's coffee cup, which had been sitting beside him untouched since she hadn't seen him drink it, and handed it to him. "Drink it before it goes cold," she said. He took it. The ghost of a smile crossed his face. Around them the room slowly, imperfectly, and with various degrees of grace resumed. The ride home from Briar Hollow was quiet for the first mile, and then Rourke said, "You're not going to say anything about what happened in there?" "I'm thinking," Lenora said. "About what?" "About several things at once. Give me a minute." He gave her more than a minute. He gave her the remaining 4 miles, which was either patience or self-preservation, and probably both. What she was thinking about was not the pie or the empty plate or Sabine's face in the moment after Rourke's spoke. She had filed those away already. What she was turning over, carefully, in the dark of the wagon ride with the cold stars above and the horse's breath steaming in the lamplight, was what Rourke had said and what it meant and what she was going to do with it. He had said, "I chose her present tense, not past tense. Not I've been grateful for her presence or she's been good for the household." Specific grammar of it was not accidental. Rourke called her, was not a man who spoke accidentally, and she knew what it meant, and she was not going to pretend she didn't. And she also was not ready to walk directly toward it yet, because the last time she had organized her life around another person, he had died in a fever tent in Kansas, and she had buried him with a borrowed pickaxe. That was the thing she was thinking about. Most of its windows were dark. When they pulled into the ranch yard, and Rourke tied the horse and helped her down, and they stood for a moment in the quiet of the night, with the barn dark and the house dark, except for the kitchen window, where Tamsin had left a lamp burning. Because Tamsin did this without being asked, had done it every evening they'd been out, had simply understood that a lamp in the window was the right thing. Lenora looked at the light and said, "What you said tonight." "Yes," he said. "Did you mean it the way it sounded?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the hesitant quiet of someone buying time, but the deliberate quiet of someone who was going to answer correctly and needed to be sure of it. "I meant every word of it exactly as it sounded," he said. She nodded. She looked at the kitchen window. "I need more time," she said. "I know," he said. No frustration in it. No performance of understanding. Just acknowledgement, simple and direct. "It's not," she started. "You don't have to explain it," he said. "I want." She turned to look at him. "It's not doubt about you. It's that I lost everything once and rebuilt from nothing, and I'm doing it again, and I need to do it in the right order. I need to know that what I'm building is mine before I build it alongside someone else. Does that make sense?" He considered it honestly. "It does." "I'm not saying no. I'm not hearing no," he said. She nodded again. She went inside. Tamsin was asleep on the bench by the stove, with a book open on her chest, and her hair loose, and her feet tucked under her, and she looked younger than 15, looked like what she was, which was a child who had lost too much, and was slowly, cautiously allowing herself to feel safe in one place. Lenora took the book and set it on the table. She put another length of wood in the stove. She sat for a while in the quiet kitchen, with the lamp and the fire and the small stone from the garret boy in her coat pocket, and she thought about right order, and about what she was building, and about whether it was possible to be lonely and grateful and frightened and certain all at the same time. She concluded it was. She went to bed. The Valley had its opinions about the banquet, and they arrived at the ranch in the specific manner of Valley opinions sideways, through third parties, wrapped in enough qualifications to allow deniability. Mrs. Fett sent a note. It arrived 3 days after the banquet via the same boy who had delivered Sabzine's invitation, which Lenora suspected was deliberate. The note was short, written in the compressed handwriting of a woman who had decided something and was not interested in using more words than necessary to convey it. "You made a good pie. Come to my house for tea when you have an afternoon free. F." Harriet Pritchard wrote a longer letter, more social in its construction, full of the careful circumlocution of a woman who lived with a husband who had opinions and had learned to say what she thought without ever quite saying it plainly. Reading between the lines, and Lenora was very good at reading between lines. The message was, what Rourke said was remarkable. What Sabine did was not surprising, and I am choosing to make myself available to you going forward, even if I cannot say so directly. Dole Pritchard, according to Cass, had told his wife on the way home that Rourke had made a fool of himself. Harriet Pritchard had allegedly responded with a silence so complete and sustained that it had communicated more than speech would have. Cass reported this with visible satisfaction. From Sabine herself, there was nothing. No response, no counteraction, no note. The absence of Sabine was almost louder than her presence had been, and Lenora knew enough about people who operated the way Sabine operated to understand that quiet did not mean finished. It meant regrouping. It meant the next move was being planned. Somewhere Lenora couldn't see it. She filed this under things I cannot control and kept cooking. The real winter arrived in the second week of January, with the particular arrogance of weather that had been holding back and had now decided to stop. Not the manageable cold of the first storm that had been frontier winter, the ordinary difficulty of the season. What came now was something different. The kind of cold that had history in it, the valley people said, the kind that only visited every decade or so, that old-timers remembered and measured other winters against. The temperature dropped so fast that the well pump froze overnight, despite the burlap wrapping Gil had put around it in November. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of the ranch property, which Rourke had said with confidence, didn't freeze. Not fully, not ever froze. Rourke stood at the kitchen window, looking at it with the expression of a man revising his assumptions. The supply road to Briar Hollow, Lenora said from behind him. If it's not already closed, it will be by morning, he said. She had already started the inventory in her head. She did it automatically now, the way other people breathed a running calculation of what was available against what was needed, updated whenever the variables changed. The variables were changing very fast. How many families between here and Briar Hollow, she asked. 3 that I know of on that stretch. The Whitaker place, the Moss widow, she's got 2 kids, and old Crane who lives alone. He turned from the window, plus whatever is in Briar Hollow itself, the Holloway Dawsons, the Pritchards, she paused. Sabine. He looked at her. Everyone, she said simply. He understood. He did not immediately agree. She watched the specific conflict of it on his face, the rancher's pragmatism, wrestling with the injury of having had his household and his judgment publicly questioned by those same people not 3 weeks prior. We don't have enough, he said, and she could not tell if it was an objection or an opening. Not if we use it the way we've been using it, she said. We do if we change how we're using it. He sat down at the kitchen table. He said, show me. She had learned in the weeks since the wagon train that the best way to present Frank Halder with a plan was to present it as arithmetic and let him reach the human conclusions himself. He was not an unfeeling man, the opposite, in fact, but he processed things through the practical first, and if the practical made sense, the rest followed. She spread the inventory on the table between them, her scrap paper system again, and walked him through it. Concentrated broth from the remaining cattle bones would go further than the bones alone. The grain supply could quite be stretched substantially if they rationed bread and moved toward porridge-based meals, which were less satisfying but more efficient. The root vegetables in the cold cellar were still good. She had checked them that morning, pulling back the layers of straw the way she did every few days, discarding anything that had started to turn so it didn't compromise what was still firm. 3 weeks' worth, she said, for the ranch and the 3 families, if we're efficient. Probably 4 if we pull in what the Whitakers and Crane have stored and consolidate. And Briar Hollow. Briar Hollow is a town. It has supplies. It's cut off from resupply, but it's not starting from nothing. She paused. What it doesn't have is organization. Nobody coordinating what gets used when and how. In a 2-week freeze, disorganized supply becomes a crisis faster than actual shortage does. Rourke was quiet, looking at the numbers. You're proposing we take food to them, he said. Through the storm. I'm proposing we take coordination to them. Food is supplementary. What they actually need is someone to tell them to stop using things faster than they have to. And you think they'll listen to the person who can demonstrate that the system works. She met his eyes. Yes. Eventually, he looked at the window. The snow was moving again, light and constant, the sky a seamless white. The sleds can make it to the Whitaker place in an hour if the wind stays down, he said. After that, he shook his head. Briar Hollow is 2 hours in good conditions. In this it's 3. Maybe more, I know, she said. Dangerous. So is running out of food in a 2-week freeze, she said. For people who didn't do anything wrong except live in the wrong place when the weather changed. He looked at her with that expression again, the open one, the one that had been appearing more frequently in recent weeks, the one that meant he had stopped editing himself around her. You understand, he said slowly, that some of those people called you a beggar widow. I know what they called me, she said. Their opinion of me doesn't change what they need. She straightened the papers on the table, and honestly, Rourke, I'm not doing it for them. I'm doing it because letting people go hungry when I have the means to help is something I can't live with. The fact that some of them were unkind is their problem to sort out, not mine. He stared at her for a moment, then he pushed his chair back and stood. I'll get Gil, he said. We'll start loading the first sled before dark. The organization of it took the rest of that day and most of the night. Lenora worked the kitchen without stopping, converting everything she could into forms that were transportable and dense. With nutrition, the bone broth reduced down to a concentrate that could be reconstituted with water and would keep in the cold flatbreads that were dry enough to travel but substantial enough to matter, dried root vegetable strips that she showed Tamsin how to prepare and package, while Lenora managed the stove. Tamsin did not complain about any of it. She worked with the specific focus she had developed over weeks of kitchen work, quick, methodical, learning on the move. She had stopped asking if she was doing things correctly and started asking only when something was genuinely unclear, which was a different kind of question and a more useful one. At some point after midnight, Tamsin said, without looking up from the flatbread she was wrapping, "You know they might not thank you." "I know," Lenora said, "the people in town after everything. I know." Tamsin was quiet for a moment. "That doesn't bother you?" "Of course it bothers me." Lenora added more wood to the stove. "Being human means it bothers you. Being an adult means you do it anyway." Tamsin looked up at her. "That seems hard," she said. "It is hard," Lenora said. "It gets less hard the more you do it, and it never gets easy. Those are both true at the same time." Tamsin went back to her wrapping. At 2 in the morning, Gil appeared in the kitchen doorway with snow on his hat and the expression of someone who had something to say but wasn't sure whether the occasion called for saying it. Lenora looked at him. "First sled's loaded," he said. "Rourke's sleeping 3 hours before we go." A pause. "You should too. I'll sleep when the broth is done reducing." Gil stood in the doorway for a moment. "Mrs. Vance?" he said, and the formality of it was unusual enough to make her pay attention. "What you're doing. The food. Going to people who he stopped. Started again. Some of those folks in Briar Hollow, they weren't decent about you." "No," she agreed. "And you're still doing this." "Still doing this," she said. He nodded. He turned to leave. Then he turned back. "I was one of them," he said quietly. "At the beginning. When you first came, I thought I had thoughts that weren't charitable. About what you were and why you were here." Lenora looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. "You knew? You were barely speaking to me for the first week. It wasn't difficult to read." His jaw tightened slightly. "I wanted to say that. Because it seemed important to say." "Thank you," she said simply. "Now get some sleep before Rourke makes you drive in 3 hours." He almost smiled. He went. Tamsin had been very quiet during this exchange, her head down, doing the wrapping with the careful attention of someone pretending very convincingly not to have heard anything. "Not a word," Lenora said. "I wasn't going to say anything," Tamsin said, with the elaborate innocence of someone who had been going to say several things. They left before dawn with 2 sleds and 4 men. Rourke drove the first with Gil and the heavier supplies. Lenora rode the second with Cass and the Fitch brothers, Ward and Dolan, who had volunteered without being asked and who communicated their feelings about this primarily through the competent and businesslike way they loafeted and secured every crate. She had left Tamsin at the ranch with precise instructions about the stove temperature and the remaining broth and strict orders not to go outside alone under any conditions, which Tamsin had agreed to with the slightly mutinous expression of someone who understood the reason for the rule and resented needing it. The cold was not the honest cold of physical discomfort. Most of its windows were dark. It was something more fundamental, the cold that made you question the intelligence of human settlement in certain latitudes, that got into your thinking before it got into your bones and made everything seem more provisional than it had the day before. Lenora had pulled on every layer she owned and still felt it at the edges, in her fingers, and the bridge of her nose, and the place where her collar didn't quite meet her hat. She kept her focus on the road. The Whitaker placed first a family of 5, 2 adults and 3 children, the youngest not yet walking. They had been managing. Ada Whitaker, who was 30, and had the composure of someone who handled emergencies by becoming very organized and slightly terrifying, answered the door with a butcher knife in her hand and an expression of pure relief when she saw who it was. "We heard the road closed," she said. "It did," Lenora said. "We've brought supplies, and I want to look at what you have stored." Ada Whitaker stepped back and let her in without any of the social hesitation that might have preceded it in other circumstances. They spent 40 minutes at the Whitaker place, Lenora, going through what they had stored, reorganizing it, showing Ada the rationing system she'd developed at the ranch, leaving enough of the concentrated broth and flatbread to supplement their stores meaningfully without depleting the sleds too much for what came next. When they left, Ada was standing in the doorway. "Mrs. Vance," she said. Lenora paused. "I heard what they said about you in Briar Hollow," Ada said. "I want you to know I don't," she stopped. "Tried again. I'm glad you came. Take care of those children," Lenora said. "We'll be back through when the road clears." The Moss widow's place was harder. Mary Moss was 28 and had 2 children under 7, and had been managing alone since her husband died of a fall the previous spring, and managing alone in this valley was the specific kind of hard that accumulated without anyone noticing, until you were standing in a kitchen with a crying child and another one, coughing, and what amounted to 4 days of adequate food left. That was where they found her. Lenora went in and looked at the situation and felt the specific cold anger of recognizing something preventable. "How long has the little one been coughing?" she asked. 4 days, Mary said. She had the flat voice of someone who had been holding herself together by sheer force and was running low on force. "It's not bad. I've had her near the stove. Keep doing that." Lenora moved through the small kitchen, assessing, reorganizing, opening containers, and evaluating. "Do you have any dried herbs?" "Some. Old. Let me see them." She found the thyme, the same kind she'd used at the ranch, same state of aging, still viable. She made a steam treatment for the child using a small pot and a cloth, showed Mary how to hold it safely. And then while Mary sat with her daughter, Lenora reorganized the food stores into a system that would last 3 weeks instead of the 4 days they'd been projected to last. It was not magic. It was inventory and ratio, and the particular kind of patience that came from having done this so many times in the past months that it had become a way of seeing rather than a set of steps. Rourke appeared in the doorway while she was finishing. He looked at the child wrapped in blankets near the stove, at Mary's face, at what Lenora had done with the kitchen in 20 minutes. He didn't say anything. He went back out and unloaded more from the sled than they had originally planned to leave. Briar Hollow was 3.5 hours in the conditions they were traveling. Nobody complained. They stopped once when the lead sled's runner caught a frozen rut and needed 2 men and considerable cursing to free. And during that stop, Lenora got down and walked the length of the road ahead to check for further hazards. And the wind hit her face with the specific personal malice of wind that has found a gap in your defenses, and she walked back to the sled with her eyes watering, and her nose completely numb, and climbed back on without comment. Cass offered her his extra wool scarf without making a ceremony of it. She took it without making a ceremony of it. That was how things worked on a sled in the middle of a blizzard. They came into Briar Hollow from the North Road just past noon. The town was muffled under snow, the specific quiet of a settlement that had stopped its ordinary business and pulled itself inward. Smoke came from chimneys. A few figures moved between buildings with the bent-forward purposefulness of people who were outside only because they had to be. Rourke pulled the sled to a stop in front of the general store, the building that served, in the absence of anything more formal, as the center of community logistics. The store was closed, but the man inside, a heavyset merchant named Beaumont who had been at the banquet and had said nothing either way, anything, opened the door when he heard the sleds and looked out with an expression that moved from surprise to something more complicated. "Calder," he said. "Beaumont," Rourke said. "We've brought supplies and someone who can help you figure out how to make them last. There's somewhere we can gather people?" Beaumont looked at Lenora. She looked back. She was wearing Cass's scarf and had snow on her hat, and her nose was bright from the cold, and she was not by any measure presenting as the kind of person who had recently made a social impression in someone's grand parlor. She also had 2 sleds of supplies behind her, and a way of looking at a situation that cut to what mattered. "The back room," Beaumont said. I can get people here in 20 minutes. It took closer to 40, but people came. Some of them Lenora recognized from the banquet, the Holloway Dawsons, who had the grace to look neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, simply present, Judge Carver, who was old enough to have seen enough bad winters, to have lost all patience for social performance, several families she didn't know by name. Dark, Mrs. Fett arrived in a coat that had seen 20 winters and sat in the corner with her arms folded and her expression of someone waiting to see if this would be worth her time. And Sabine Crowell came. She came last and she came alone, which was the first unexpected thing. She stood near the door in her burgundy coat. Even in a crisis, she dressed with precision, which Lenora recognized as not vanity but armor, and she looked at Lenora and said nothing. Lenora did not acknowledge her directly. Not yet. She spread her inventory sheets on Beaumont's counter and started talking. She was not a natural public speaker in the formal sense. She had no gift for rhetoric, no performer's instinct for when to pause and when to push. What she had was specificity and the complete absence of condescension, and in a room full of frightened people, those things were more useful than eloquence. She told them what they needed to know, how long the freeze was likely to hold based on what Rourke said and what the sky looked like, how to assess their current stores accurately rather than optimistically, how to consolidate usage so that 12 households stretching their individual supplies independently was less efficient than 12 households coordinating, how to make the concentrated broth they'd brought go 4 times as far as it would if used as was. She answered questions. She did not make anyone feel stupid for asking them. Judge Carver asked the most practical questions. Mrs. Fett asked 2 questions that were extremely specific and indicated she had been thinking about this already. The Holloway Dawson wife asked about the children specifically, and Lenora answered her fully and without any of the territorial coldness that the woman might have expected given the banquet. For 30 minutes, the room was simply people in a hard situation, listening to someone who knew things they needed to know. Then Beaumont said, "What about coordination? Who manages the distribution?" Lenora looked at the room. "That should be someone you trust. Someone who's already here and already part of this community." She paused. "Not me. I'm here for 2 days and then I go back to the ranch." "Then who's?" someone said. A pause. Then Mrs. Fett uncrossed her arms. "I'll do it," she said, with the flat practicality of someone who had done it before and had stopped pretending she wouldn't end up doing it again. "If Mrs. Vance gives me the system in writing before she leaves." "I will," Lenora said. "Tonight then," Mrs. Fett said. "Come for supper. Bring the papers." It was the most direct social invitation Lenora had received in Briar Hollow, and it came from the only person in the valley whose opinion she had identified, within 10 minutes of meeting her, as something worth having. Tonight, she agreed. The meeting broke up. People were quieter going out than they'd been coming. In the quiet of people who had been frightened and were now less frightened and were adjusting to the change in internal temperature. Lenora was rolling her papers back up when she heard the door. She knew without turning. Sabine Crowell had not left with the others. Lenora finished rolling the papers and tied them and turned. Sabine says. Sabine stood in the middle of the empty room with her coat still on, and her hands at her sides, and her expression doing something complicated that was not the controlled social performance of the banquet. This was something rawer, less managed. She looked older in it somehow, more human. "I have 2 families on my street," Sabine said. "A widow with an infant and an old man who doesn't ask for anything from anyone. They haven't said they're short on supplies, but I know they are." She paused. "I don't know how to do what you described." "The rationing. I have the resources, but not the..." She stopped. "The knowledge," Lenora said. "The knowledge," Sabine said, and the word cost her something. Lenora could see that plainly. Lenora looked at her for a moment. She did not feel what she had expected to feel. She had thought she would feel satisfaction, or justice, or the particular vindication of watching someone who had tried to diminish you forced to need you. She felt none of those things, or rather she felt traces of them, thin and not particularly interesting, and beneath them something more durable, just the assessment. A person in front of her who needed something she could provide. "I'll come by tomorrow morning," Lenora said. "Early. Bring me to the widow and the old man first." Sabine looked at her. "Why are you?" She stopped. "Because they need help," Lenora said simply. And because you're the person who can get me to them, the reason doesn't go further than that. A long pause. I said things, Sabine said. In public. About you. You did, Lenora said. There were reasons. I know what the reasons were, Lenora said. I understand them. Understanding them doesn't mean I agreed with how you expressed them. She picked up her papers. That's between you and yourself to sort out. What's in front of us right now is the widow and the old man and a 2-week freeze. Can we start there? Sabine stood very still. Whatever she had prepared to say, speech or explanation or further defense she had constructed in the sleepless nights since the banquet, she did not say it. She nodded. Early, she said. 6 o'clock, Lenora said. She walked out into the cold. Rourke was waiting by the sled. He looked at her when she came out, registering the expression on her face with the specific attentiveness he'd developed over weeks of sharing space with her. How'd it go? He said. Sabine is going to bring me to 2 households tomorrow morning. He went very still, Sabine. Yes. Sabine Crowell. I know who I mean, Rourke. He looked at her for a moment, then at the building she'd come out of, then back at her. All right, he said, slowly. It's not complicated, she said. People need things. I know how to help. The rest is other people's business. He was quiet as they got. The sled turned around. Then he said, You're a more patient person than I am. I'm a more hungry person than you've ever been, she said. It teaches you things patience doesn't. He looked at her with that open expression. The sled moved. The cold pressed in from all sides. She thought about Sabine standing in that empty room, stripped of the banquet and the burgundy and the architecture of a life built on being significant, and looking at Lenora with the face of someone who needed a thing they didn't know how to ask for. She thought about herself 4 months ago, standing at a frozen grave with a borrowed pickaxe, needing things she didn't know how to ask for either. She had not expected compassion to feel this unremarkable. She had thought it would feel more like a choice and less like a reflex. There it was. She pulled Cass's scarf tighter around her face. Supper with Mrs. Feta was in 2 hours, and she had papers to write. She had work to do. She always had work to do, and outside the worst winter. Blackthorn Ridge had seen in a decade pressed down on every roof and road and frozen creek, on the widow with the infant and the old man who didn't ask for anything, and the 15-year-old back at the ranch, checking the stove the way Lenora had shown her, pressing down on all of it, equally, and without preference, the way hard weather always did, not caring at all who deserved it and who didn't. What it didn't account for was the people who knew how to push back. The freeze held for 11 days. Not the 2 weeks Rourke had predicted, not the 3 that the oldest ranch hand in the valley's memory could recall, but 11 days that were long enough to test everything and everyone and leave a mark that didn't fully fade even after the temperature climbed and the roads opened and the ordinary business of the valley resumed its ordinary rhythm. Lenora spent those 11 days moving between the ranch and Briar Hollow and back, following the system she had written out for Mrs. Fett, adjusting it when the variables changed, which they did constantly because variables always did. Concentrated broth lasted longer than projected because Mrs. Fett turned out to have a talent for enforcement that surpassed even Lenora's. She distributed with the cheerful implacability of someone who had decided the system would be followed and simply waited for everyone to arrive at the same conclusion. Nobody argued with her twice. The widow with the infant was named Clara Marsh, and she was 24 and had been alone since October when her husband had gone to get winter supplies and come back with a fever that took him inside a week. She had the specific hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone who had been surviving at the edge of their capacity. For so long they'd stopped noticing the edge. Lenora sat in her kitchen the first morning, Sabine having knocked and introduced her with the stiff courtesy of someone reading from a script they'd written but never practiced, and looked at what Clara had, and reorganized it, and showed her 3 things she could do with what remained that she hadn't thought of. Clara watched with the intense focus of someone filing information away for survival, which was exactly what it was. Sabine stood in the corner of the kitchen during all of this. She did not speak. She watched Lenora work, and she watched Clara's face change from the hollow-eyed endurance into something with more light in it. And whatever was happening behind Sabine's own face during that time was private, and Lenora did not examine it. On the way back out through the cold, Sabine said, "She's been alone since October." "I know," Lenora said. "I didn't." Sabine stopped walking. I knew she was there. I sent a basket at Christmas. I didn't go and sit in her kitchen. Lenora looked at her. You're here now. Because of a blizzard. Most of us arrive at the right place because something pushed us there, Lenora said. The pushing isn't the point. What you do when you get there is. Sabine looked at her with an expression that was not the controlled social face and not the raw vulnerability of the empty meeting room, and not quite either of the things Lenora had seen from her before. Something's in between. Something that looked like a person standing at the beginning of a thought they hadn't finished yet. She didn't say anything. They went to the old man's house. His name was Elias Crane, and he was 73, and he had been in this valley since before it was properly settled, and he received Lenora's presence in his kitchen with the equanimity of someone who had seen enough of the world to be unsurprised by most of it. He had adequate supplies, as it turned out not comfortable, but adequate because he had been doing his own careful rationing since the sky changed, working from an instinct built over 73 winters. He looked at Lenora's system when she showed it to him. He made one suggestion. It was a good suggestion. She incorporated it. You'll do, he said, which was the highest compliment she received in Briar Hollow, and she was aware of it. On the 6th day of the freeze, Tamsin taught herself something new. Lenora discovered this when she returned to the ranch late in the afternoon and found the kitchen smelling different than she'd left it, not wrong, but different. The particular smell of an experiment that had gone in an interesting direction rather than the expected one. Tamsin was at the stove with her back to the door, and the expression of someone who had been hoping for a little more time before being evaluated. What did you do? Lenora said. I had an idea, Tamsin said. Lenora came around to look at the pot. Inside was a version of the root vegetable soup they'd been making, but Tamsin had added something dried berries, the last of them, and a small measure of something Lenora identified by smell as the apple cider vinegar from the high she used occasionally and sparingly for flavor. She took the spoon and tasted it. It was not perfect. The balance was slightly off, more sour than sweet, the berries having given more than the base could absorb without adjustment. But the idea behind it was sound the acid cutting through the heaviness of the roots, the berry giving it a dimension that made it interesting rather than merely sustaining. It needs something, Tamsin said, watching her face. A small amount of the molasses, Lenora said, just enough to bring the sweet back up to meet the sour. She handed the spoon back. Try it. Tamsin added the molasses carefully, tasted, adjusted by instinct, tasted again. Her face changed. Oh, she said. Yes, Lenora said. Tamsin stood looking at the pot with the expression of someone who had discovered a thing rather than learned it, which was the real moment, not the technique, but the understanding that technique served, the understanding that food was a conversation between ingredients and you were the one deciding what they said to each other. Lenora didn't make a speech about it. She got a second spoon and they finished the soup together. That night, after Tamsin had gone to sleep, Lenora sat at the kitchen table with the lamp and the stone from the Garrett boy and a piece of paper, and she wrote down the soup recipe with the modification, and she put Tamsin's name at the top of it, not because it was perfect, because it was hers. The freeze broke on the 11th morning, the way winter concessions always broke gradually, and then all at once, the temperature rising a few degrees overnight, the particular quality of the light changing at dawn from the flat white of freeze to something that had depth in it again. By mid-morning, water was moving at the edges of the creek, and by afternoon the supply road to Briar Hollow had been pronounced passable by Gill, who delivered this verdict with the satisfaction of a man who had been right about something he'd predicted. The valley exhaled. Lenora stood in the kitchen and felt the change in the air and thought, now, because now was when everything that had been suspended during the crisis would resume the normal life of the ranch, the normal distance between Blackthorn and Briar Hollow, the ordinary separateness of people who had been forced into closeness by weather and were now free to return to their usual intervals. And with that resumption would come the questions she had been setting aside, carefully and deliberately, because the freeze had not been the time for them. She was still standing at the window when Rourke came in, poured coffee, set one cup in front of her, sat down. They were quiet for a moment. The road's open, she said. It is. Clara Marsh is going to need someone to check on her through the rest of winter, Lenora said. He's managing, but she's been alone too long. and she needs more of a community than she's been getting. I'll mention it to Mrs. Fett. I already did. She said yes, but she'll need someone with a sled on the bad days. I'll send Cass, Rourke said. He paused. What else? Lenora turned from the window, sat down across from him. You asked me to stay, she said. I did. You said you wanted time to find out what it was. I said that. Have you found out? He looked at her steadily. Yes. Tell me, she set his coffee cup down. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was choosing words rather than delaying the specific quality of his silence she had learned to distinguish from the other kinds. I was 33 when my wife died, he said. Eleanor. She was 28. The baby we never got far enough to name him. He paused. I kept the ranch going because it was what there was to do. I got up every morning and I did the work because the work didn't stop needing doing. And somewhere in that, I stopped expecting anything from a day except that it would end and the next ones would start. He looked at the kitchen, at the pots on the hooks, at the sourdough crock on the shelf alive, breathing, fed every day now without thinking about it. And then you walked in here with flour on your hands at midnight and told me you needed my kitchen, he said. And I thought, this woman is going to be trouble. I was trouble, Lenora said. The best kind, he said. And then, before she could respond to that, I know what it is. What I feel. I've known for a while. I was waiting for the right time, and I've realized the right time is just time I've decided to stop wasting. He met her eyes. I love you, Lenora. Not what you do for this house. Not what you cook, or how you manage things, or what you've built here. You. The person who tells me uncomfortable truths and stays up all night to make sure 40 strangers have bread and refuses to let another person's contempt decide what she's worth. He stopped. I want to marry you when you're ready. If you're ready. There's no ultimatum in it. Lenora looked at him. She thought about Thomas, as she always did, when she approached this, not with grief as sharp as it had been, but with the particular tenderness of something that had moved into its permanent place. She thought about the frozen Kansas grave and the $14 and the borrowed pickaxe and the long blurring miles of the trail. She thought about what she'd built since then, not just the practical pieces, the kitchen, the community, the supply systems, and the rationing and Tamsin's soup, but the interior thing, the knowledge of herself that had been assembled incrementally in the months since she'd stopped moving and started staying. She was not the same person who had buried her husband. She was more. She looked at Rourke Calder, who had opened his barn in a blizzard and his kitchen to a widow and his carefully contained life to the particular disruption of being known by someone, and she thought, this is what enough looks like. Not perfect. Enough. I'm ready, she said. He went still. I've been ready for a while, she said. I was waiting for the right order. She paused. I think I had the order right. You usually do, he said. She almost smiled. Don't make a habit of saying that. I'll try, he said. He reached across the table. She put her hand in his. His hand was warm from the coffee cup and rough from 36 years of physical work and completely steady. They sat like that for a moment. Outside, the creek was running again. Most of its windows were dark. They married in July beneath the cottonwoods at the eastern edge of the ranch property on a morning when the light came in at the angle that made it look like it was just beginning. Lenora wore a dress she had made herself over 6 weeks, not the green wool of the banquet, but something lighter, cream-colored, practical at the hem, because she was not the kind of woman who stood still long enough for an impractical hem to be worth it. Tamsin had helped with the buttonholes, which were Tamsin's best work so far, and which Tamsin would tell anyone who asked, several times. Heck Dodson came back for it. He arrived 3 days before with the Garrett family, who had turned around from the pass when the spring letter reached them. Some of the settlers had continued west, but a handful had found reasons to return to the valley, and the Garretts were among them. The Garrett boy, whose name turned out to be Owen, and who was in fact 6, attended the wedding with the stone he'd given Lenora as though he had known its ultimate purpose from the beginning. Gil wore a clean shirt. It was noted. Cass cried during the vows. He denied this afterward with the specific vehemence of a man whose denial only confirmed the thing denied. Mrs. Fett came with a jar of preserved fruit she had made herself and handed it to Lenora with the direct practicality of someone who understood that what a kitchen needed after a wedding was good ingredients. Harriet Pritchard came without her husband, who had a previous commitment that everyone understood was a social choice rather than a scheduling conflict, and she hugged Lenora briefly but firmly and said, in Lenora's ear, "You were right about him," which Lenora understood, and which required no further discussion. And Sabine Crowell came. This was the thing nobody entirely expected, including Lenora. She arrived as its windows were dark. She arrived at the edge of the cottonwoods near the end of the gathering, dressed simply for Sabine, with none of her usual architecture of presentation. She did not approach Rourke. She came to Lenora. "I'm not going to make a speech," she said. "I'm not good at apologies, and I have enough self-knowledge to not attempt one in public." "All right," Lenora said. "I wanted you to know," Sabine paused, and behind the pausing was the genuine difficulty of a person who had operated for years on the certainty of their own correctness and was working out how to exist on different terms. "I have been thinking about what you said, about arriving somewhere because something pushed you. I've been thinking about it for 6 months, and," Lenora said. "And I'm selling the merchant interest," Sabine said. "Not because I have to. Because I want to do something different with what I have left, and I can't do it while I'm managing import routes and maintaining the right appearances." She met Lenora's eyes. "I don't know exactly what yet, but I'm going to find out." Lenora looked at her for a moment. "Clara Marsh needs a friend," she said. "A real one, not a Christmas basket." Something shifted in Sabine's face. "I know, she won't come to you," Lenora said. "You'd have to go to her." "I know that too," Sabine said quietly. She left shortly after. She didn't stay for the food, which was generous to the point of embarrassment. The ranch hands had contributed to it in a way that suggested they'd been planning it for longer than they admitted, and the result was a table that would have made any occasion feel like a celebration, which was the point. Tamsin had made the bread, every single loaf. She had been up since before dawn to do it, refusing help except for the one moment when the oven temperature needed watching, and she'd Lenora checked so she could start the next batch, and the bread was good, genuinely good, not beginner's good, but the good of someone who had developed real instinct alongside the technique, who understood what she was doing and why. When people commented on it, as they did repeatedly, and with the specific enthusiasm of people who recognized quality, Tamsin received it with the careful composure of someone trying very hard not to look as pleased as they were. Lenora watched this from across the table and felt the same thing she'd felt when she wrote Tamsin's name on the soup recipe, particular warmth of watching someone become more themselves. In the fall of that year, they built the addition. It was Lenora's idea, proposed over the kitchen table in the practical manner of all her ideas with numbers and rationale and a clear articulation of the problem it solved. The ranch kitchen was too small for what it had become. Not just their household, but the thing the kitchen had quietly become. Over the months since the freeze, the place people came when they needed something. Clara Marsh came on Tuesdays. Mrs. Fett came when she needed to think through a problem out loud, which was more frequently than she would have admitted. The Whitaker children came after the school day because Ada Whitaker worked late, and Lenora's kitchen was warm, and nobody was asked to justify their presence there. The addition was a larger cooking space, a long table that could seat 20, a pantry with deep shelves, and a room at the back that could serve as either storage or, if needed, a place for someone to sleep who needed somewhere to sleep. Rourke built it with Gil and the Fitch brothers and Cass, and on weekends, whoever from Briar Hollow wanted to help in exchange for the meals Lenora produced during the construction, which were reliably worth coming for. They called it Blackthorn Hearth. It was not a formal name. Tamsin had said it, one evening, "This place is the hearth of Blackthorn," and it had simply attached itself to the thing the way names did when they were accurate. Travelers came through that first winter. The wagon trains had resumed their westward movement with the spring, and Blackthorn Hearth became a known stop not advertised, not official, but known in the way frontier stops were known, through the word of people who had been received and fed and sent on with their provisions supplemented. They asked for nothing. Whatever a person could give labor, a portion of their own supplies, the skill of a particular trade, that was the exchange. If they had nothing, the meal was still there. Lenora was not running a charity. She was running a kitchen, and the kitchen's position was that no person sitting at its table was there as a supplicant. They were there as a person, which was the only qualification required. Tamsin managed more of it as the months went on. She was 16 by the time the addition was finished, and 17 by the time she was running the morning operations without supervision, and somewhere in that year, she stopped being Lenora's apprentice in any formal sense and became her partner in the practical sense, which was the more meaningful one. The school in Briar Hollow had been a non-negotiable condition, and Tamsin had honored it with the compliance of someone who had discovered, to their irritation, that they actually liked learning things and couldn't now pretend otherwise. She was good at figures. She was better at reading than she let on. She had opinions about things she'd read and expressed them, when pressed, with the careful precision of someone who had learned that opinions were more powerful when they were accurate than when they were loud. One afternoon, Lenora found her in the kitchen with a piece of paper, writing something. "What is that?" Lenora asked. Tamsin covered it slightly, then didn't. "A recipe," she said, "for the flatbread. But I changed it." "How?" "The way you changed things. Trying something and seeing what it does." She looked at the paper. "I added dried herbs earlier in the process, instead of at the end. It's more integrated." Lenora reached out. Tamsin handed her the paper. She read it. The language was clear, practical, specific about temperatures and timing, and the sensory cues that told you when a stage was complete, the vocabulary of someone who cooked with their attention fully engaged. "This is good," Lenora said. "I know," Tamsin said, without false modesty and without arrogance, just accurate. Lenora handed it back. "We should start writing them all down," she said. "Every recipe, every variation. The things we figured out during the freeze, the things we found by accident, the changes that worked." Tamsin looked at her. "Why? Because someday we won't be here, and this knowledge should be," Lenora said simply. "Things that matter should survive the people who found them." Tamsin looked at the recipe in her hands. She looked at the kitchen. "All right," she said. "Where do we start?" "At the beginning," Lenora said. "Bone broth, cold water, cracked bones, patience." They started that evening, and they kept going for the better part of a year, and what they produced was not a beautiful document. It was written in two different hands, with corrections and additions and arguments in the margins about the right amount of time and whether the sourdough starter needed daily feeding or could skip a day without consequence. And it had food stains on some pages and a burn mark on the corner of the section about stovetop temperature, because someone had set it too close to the fire, and it was exactly what it should be, a record of real knowledge gathered by real people who learned things the hard way and thought it was worth remembering. Rourke read it one evening, sitting at the kitchen table while Lenora cleaned the cast iron, and Tamsin was at school in Briar Hollow, and the house was the particular good quiet of a house that had people in it who would return. He turned the pages slowly. He stopped on the bone broth page. "This is the first thing you made," he said. "That first night." "Yes," she said. "I remember the smell of it." He looked at the page. "I was standing in the doorway." "I know," she said. "I could hear you." He looked up. "I thought I was quiet." "You were," she said. "I just pay attention." He looked at the page for another moment. "You've built something real here," he said, not effusively, just the plain statement of it, the way he said things that were true and important without ceremony, because ceremony would have made it smaller. She set down the cast iron. She looked at the kitchen, at the pots on the hooks, the sourdough on the shelf, the recipe book on the table, the lamp burning in the window, because that was what they did, and somewheres in the last year, it had become the thing that marked home more reliably than anything else, the lamp in the window. Meaning, someone is here, someone is waiting. You are expected. "We've built something real," she said. The correction was gentle. It was also necessary. "Yes," he said. "We." She picked the cast iron back up. She finished cleaning it. Outside, the last light of the evening was doing something generous with the sky over Blackthorn Ridge, the kind of light that made the valley look like a place that had decided to be beautiful without asking permission. Cottonwoods were moving in a light wind. The creek was running. The barn was solid and lit, and full of the sounds of animals settled for the night. She thought about Thomas sometimes still, not with the sharpness of grief, but with the quieter quality of memory that had found its proper place, the 22-year-old man who had believed in Oregon with his whole chest, who had laughed easily and argued about small things, who had been the beginning of a life she had not finished building. She did not believe his death had happened for a reason. She believed that things happened, and you decided what to build from them, and that the deciding was the entire point, and that you could decide badly or well, and the difference mattered enormously, and was always, entirely yours. She had decided well, not without cost, not without difficulty, not without the long, grinding work of getting up every morning and doing the thing that needed doing even when doing it was the last thing she had the energy for. But well, she put the cast iron on its hook. She poured 2 cups of coffee. She set one in front of Rourke, who was still looking at the recipe book with the expression of a man reading something that mattered, and she sat down across from him, and the fire crackled, and the lamp burned in the window, and outside the valley that had once called her a beggar widow lay quiet in the evening air, fed and warm, and not entirely aware of who it had to thank for that. She was all right with that. She had never done any of it to be thanked. She had done it because it was there to be done, and because 40 people needed bread, and because a 15-year-old girl needed someone to hand her a spoon and tell her she was capable, and because a house that had been dark for 3 years deserved to have its lamp lit again, and because sometimes the entire shape of a life turns on a single decision to walk into a kitchen and start working instead of standing at the door, wondering whether you're welcome. She hadn't waited to find out if she was welcome. She had made herself necessary, and then she had made herself a home, and then she had made herself a life worth choosing twice. The lamp burned. The coffee was warm. Rourke reached across the table without looking up from the recipe book and covered her hand with his. She turned her hand over and held on. That was all. That was everything.